It's a very warm welcome to our assembly for this week. Now, I wonder if you and your families are planning to go on holiday later on this year when the restrictions are lifted. Well, this morning I brought my suitcase. Now, if I were going on holiday, I would have to think about what I was going to put in my suitcase. I would have to get prepared. I would put some of my bright shirts in because I like them. And I would hope that the weather would be nice and sunny. So I'd take my sun hat and my sunglasses. Talking of the sun, I would also pack some sun cream. And the other thing I would pack would be a couple of pairs of swimming trunks. I hope you like mine. I like them. I like bright clothes. And you put a lot of other things in your case. But you would have to think about it and get prepared. And it's like that at your school. You're probably prepared if there's a fire drill. If the fire bell goes, you know what you have to do and where you have to go. Somewhere outside at the fire point so you can be all checked off and everyone is kept safe. Now, this week's story, Jesus tells us, is about people being prepared and some people not being prepared. But before I tell you the story, I need to give you a bit of background of what it was like for Jewish weddings in the first century when Jesus was here walking around on the earth. Normally, the wedding started at night and the bride would wait at her house with her family and her bridesmaids. They would help get her ready, and then sometime during the evening or the night, the bridegroom would come, call for his wife, and they would go to their new house where they were going to live, have their home, and they had a great big party. And the bride's family and the people, the guests invited, would follow them in a joyful procession from the bride's house to the bridegroom's and bride's new house. Now, the bridesmaids of the bride would have lamps, and they were, in those days, they were about as big as my hand. They were clay lamps, hollow, in the shape of a little bit like the Aladdin's lamp, if you've seen the Disney film on that. So there was a big hole at the top where you put in the oil, and a little hole a bit like a spout where you put the wick. And then it was lit and you had light. But the oil had to be topped up through the big hole so that it wouldn't go out. Now, this is a story that Jesus told about a wedding. Once upon a time, there was a wedding. It was a big wedding. It was so big that the bride had 10 bridesmaids. The bridesmaids helped the bride get ready for a wedding. And they got their lamps ready for when the bridegroom called for her. So they filled them up with oil and lit them and waited for the bride. Now, 5 of these bridesmaids were wise. They'd planned ahead and had some spare oil. But 5 of them weren't wise and didn't plan ahead. They brought no spare oil. The bridegroom took a while to come. The bride and the bridesmaids got very sleepy. And they actually fell asleep. At last, someone shouted, "The bridegroom's here! The bridegroom's here!" They all woke up and got their lamps ready. But the 5 bridesmaids who hadn't got any spare oil, their lamps had gone out. And they said to the 5 that had their lamps burning with the spare oil, "Can you give us some of your oil?" But they couldn't, because otherwise they wouldn't have had enough. So the 5 bridesmaids with their lamps went with the bride out into the street and met the husband, and they followed the great big joyful procession of all the guests. The unwise bridesmaids had to run out into the town trying to find spare oil, which would have been very difficult at night. Meanwhile, the procession got to the new home and everybody went in and they started a great big party. The bridegroom shut and locked the door because he didn't want anyone sneaking into the party that wasn't invited. When, a bit later on, the foolish bridesmaids came to the door and knocked, the bridegroom went to the door and said, "I don't know you. You can't come in." All the bridesmaids needed to be prepared, and they needed to be patient as they waited for the bridegroom. These are really good qualities for us to have. Now, I'd like to tell you a story, a true story, that shows us about being ready and being patient. This is a true story about a man who was well prepared and very patient. He was born in 1791 and his inventions are still being used today. In fact, you've probably used something today that his inventions made possible. Michael Faraday stared at his workbench, at his equipment, at his files. Why wasn't this experiment working? He really believed that electricity and magnetism, when working together, could make things move. But until he proved it, it was just a theory, an idea. But theories were no good on their own. He had to be prepared. He had to be sure he was right, because electricity could be dangerous if things went wrong. He wouldn't give up hope. He felt that God would reward his patience and his preparation one day. He looked around his laboratory at all the different bottles, different shaped bottles, different chemicals on all his shelves. And as the sun came through the window and hit the glass, they twinkled. They seemed to be saying to Michael, "Go on, find out our secrets." Michael murmured to himself, "With God's help, I will." This fascination with science for Michael began in Mr. Rybu's bookshop, where he'd been an apprentice bookbinder. He loved reading the books that the customers brought in for binding, particularly anything on chemistry or electricity would fascinate him. Mr. Rybu, the owner, would shout, "You're here to bind 'em, Michael, not to read 'em." But Michael knew that Mr. Rybu would have a smile on his face. He was like a second father to Michael. He'd hired him when Michael was just 13 as a delivery boy. But when he saw how hard working Michael was, he gave him an apprenticeship a year later when Michael was 14. And this meant that Michael's future was secure. But for Michael, it was the world of science that excited him. Its experiments, its explosions, its dangers, its discoveries. Maybe some of you would like science as well, doing experiments, finding things out. What if this? What if that? Michael would ask. And he longed to be a scientist himself so that he could answer the questions that he had. The most exciting lectures on science were given by Sir Humphrey Davy. Michael went to these lectures and took notes of Sir Humphrey's lectures, his talks. And he went home and he wrote them up in his best handwriting. And because he was a bookbinder, when he got a lot of notes, he put them together in a book and he posted the book off to Sir Humphrey Davy with a letter. In a letter, he asked if he could come to work for Sir Humphrey Davy. It was like a chance in a million of him saying yes. It would be like today you writing to Little Mix or another famous pop group asking if you could join their band. But amazingly, it worked. Just after the book arrived, Humphrey Davy's assistants, one of them, got sacked for fighting. And Michael took his place. Michael must have said, wow, or whatever you said in 1813. He was so pleased that he got this position. And he probably said thank you because Michael believed in God. He believed that God was guiding him and helping him. He'd been a member of a church near St. Paul's Cathedral in London since he was a small boy. God actually had another surprise in store for Michael because shortly after he joined, Sir Humphrey went on an 18-month tour of Europe to speak to the top scientists. Sir Humphrey took his wife and Michael. Michael didn't like being bossed about by Humphrey Davy's wife, which is what happened, and he missed his home cooking. But he loved meeting the scientists and talking with them. He actually met two very famous scientists called Ampere and Volta. You might recognise their names because they gave their names to ways of measuring electricity that we use today, amps and volts. You can guess what subject they talked about when they got together. Well, on returning home, Michael plunged into all kinds of experiments. He experimented with sugar and seaweed, stainless steel and heat-proof glass, discovering things that would make life safer and better. But electricity was the thing that fascinated Michael most. No one really used electricity in those days. Even Ampere and Volta couldn't see how it could change the world. But Michael Faraday could. He made a decision to say nothing about his ideas for the time being. He needed to prepare and be sure that he was absolutely right. Weeks, months went by. Months stretched into years. He kept thinking and experimenting and planning. He couldn't afford to jump to conclusions because electricity was dangerous. He had to make sure his ideas were safe. And then it happened. Using magnets, batteries and wire, something moved. It moved through the power of electricity. He checked his results. Yes! He checked his results again. Yes, it's definitely it. He was now sure. He could tell everyone what he discovered. By 1862, Michael had recorded over 16,000 experiments. By then, he'd invented his big three: the electric motor, the transformer, and the dynamo. Dozens of inventions since then use those three things. They depend on those three things. Have you turned on a light this morning? Did you go to school in a car? Did you, or your mums, make some toast by putting it in the toaster? All those three inventions and many others depend upon Michael's invention. We should be glad for a man who didn't jump to conclusions, was really, really patient and extremely well prepared. That's how he got it right and invented something that has benefited the world for years and years and years. Wow. I hope you enjoyed that story. That's one of the moral messages, I think, that Jesus' story of the 10 bridesmaids teach, that we're to be patient and that we're to be ready. But what about the spiritual meaning of that story of the 10 bridesmaids? I think it's a lesson that teaches that Jesus is with us. And I think it's good if we keep that in mind. If we keep that in mind, we want to live in a way that pleases Jesus. This doesn't mean worrying about being afraid of God, but just knowing that God is near and he calls us to care for our neighbours. Be watchful of those around you. Be thoughtful, helpful, kind, caring, considerate. Christians believe that the wedding party in the story reminds us that heaven is a wonderful place of joy and a place where Jesus is, and it's a place that we can look forward to in the future. Well, I hope you've liked the story of the 10 Bridesmaids and the story of Michael Faraday. Maybe, if you wanted to this week, you could make up 2 or 3 questions from the story and ask your person that sits next to you, or maybe on your table. Split into 2 teams if your teachers think that's a good idea. Think of 3 or 4 questions for each team based on the stories and see if you can get the answer right. Anyway, it's great to see you again, and next couple of weeks we'll do some Easter themed assemblies because that is coming up very soon. Bye. Bye.